The call came at 2:47 in the morning, and I know the exact time because I had just checked my phone to see if my husband had texted me back. He hadn't. That should have been my first sign that something was very wrong. Not just with the road I was driving on, but with everything I thought I knew about my life. I had been coming home from my mother-in-law's house in Columbus, a drive I had made dozens of times. 3 hours on I-71, flat Ohio highway. Nothing dramatic about it. I always made that drive when things got tense at home, which had been happening more and more since my husband started his business with his college friend. I needed to clear my head, and spending a few days with her felt easier than sitting in our house watching him take calls in the garage with the door shut. I never made it home. The investigators told me later that my car drifted across the center line and hit a concrete barrier at 52 miles an hour. I don't remember any of it. I remember the radio. I remember thinking I should stop for gas in Mansfield, and then I remember waking up in a hospital room in Richland County, with my left arm in a cast and a nurse standing over me, asking if I knew what year it was. I told her the year. She nodded and wrote something down. It took me another 30 seconds to remember that I was 7 months pregnant. I started screaming before I could form actual words. The nurse grabbed my hand and told me the baby was okay. The baby had survived. She was in the NICU, but she was breathing on her own and her numbers were improving. I had delivered my daughter, 32 weeks, 3 pounds 11 ounces, while I was unconscious on an operating table in a hospital 2 hours from home. I cried so hard I pulled something in my ribs, which I did not know was possible. My husband arrived the next morning. He came in holding a coffee cup and wearing the expression of a man who had been very inconvenienced, not the expression of a man whose wife had almost died and whose premature daughter was 2 floors below us in a warming unit. He kissed me on the forehead. He asked how I was feeling. He said traffic on 71 had been bad. I asked him if he had seen the baby. He said he'd looked through the window on his way up, not gone in. Looked through the window. Like she was a display. I told myself he was in shock. I told myself that people handle fear differently. I had been telling myself a lot of things about my husband for about 8 months at that point, because the alternative, that the man I married had become someone I didn't recognize, was too large to look at directly. My parents drove in from Pittsburgh that same day. My mother arrived first, while my father parked the car. She walked in, looked at me, looked at my husband, and something shifted in her face, very quickly, like a curtain being pulled. And then she was hugging me and telling me everything was fine. I noticed she didn't ask about the baby right away either. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. My mother had been knitting things for that baby since October. She had a name list. She had opinions about stroller brands. And she walked into that hospital room and asked me about my arm before she asked about her granddaughter. My father came in 20 minutes later. He shook my husband's hand for a long time. They stood near the window and spoke quietly while my mother sat with me, and I watched them from the bed and thought, they already talked on the phone before they got here. They coordinated something. I didn't know why I thought that. I just did. The doctor came in that afternoon and explained my recovery timeline. 6 weeks minimum before I could lift anything significant, some follow-up imaging for my head, physical therapy for the arm. She said I had been lucky, which people kept saying, and which felt less and less true each hour that passed. After the doctor left, my mother asked where I would be staying during recovery. I said home, obviously, with my husband. That was my house. She looked at my father, he looked at my husband. My husband looked at his phone. I said, what is happening right now? Nobody answered immediately. My mother started talking about how our house had stairs, and the baby was going to be in the NICU for at least another 3 weeks, and maybe it would make more sense for me to stay somewhere more manageable during recovery. Somewhere on one level, and she had been thinking about this, and perhaps the best thing would be, she paused. Perhaps I should look into a short-term rental, or something near the hospital, not their house. A rental. I said, Mom, are you telling me to go stay in a rental while I recover from a car accident and my daughter is in the NICU? She said she just meant temporarily, and that their house had the dogs, and the dogs were a lot right now. And, I said, I have never been allergic to your dogs. I have stayed in your house my entire life. She stopped talking. The room was quiet for a long time. Then my husband said that he thought my mother had a point, that there was a lot going on right now, and maybe we should think about what made the most practical sense, and that he had been talking to my parents about how to best support everyone during this time. Everyone, not me. Everyone. I looked at the 3 of them standing there in my hospital room, and something clicked into place in my chest that I hadn't felt before. Not sadness. Not confusion. Something colder. The feeling you get when you realize a joke is being told at your expense and everyone in the room knows the punchline but you. I said I was tired and asked them to leave. After they left, I lay in that bed for a long time staring at the ceiling tiles. The hospital was quiet. Down the hall, somewhere, a monitor was beeping in a slow, steady rhythm. My daughter was 2 floors below me, breathing in a plastic box, and her father had looked at her through a window. I thought about the last 8 months. My husband's a man I had met twice. Had started calling the house in the evenings. My husband had started keeping his laptop password protected. In March, he had mentioned, very casually, that he thought we should update our estate documents now that we had a baby coming. And he had sent me to an attorney he chose. And I had signed things I had read, but maybe not read carefully enough. I thought about my grandmother's house. She had passed 14 months earlier, and she had left me her property, a paid-off Craftsman in Lakewood, worth somewhere around $400,000 now with the market the way it was. I was her only grandchild on my mother's side. The house was in my name. It had been in my name since the will cleared probate. Or at least I thought it was. The night nurse came in around 11 to check my vitals. She was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she had a way of moving through the room that made you feel like everything was fine even when it clearly wasn't. She asked if I needed anything for pain. I said, no. She asked if I had eaten dinner. I said I wasn't hungry. She looked at me for a moment. She said, honey, in this job you learn to tell the difference between someone who's in physical pain and someone who's in a different kind of pain. You want me to call anyone? I almost said no, and then I thought of my grandfather. He was 73 years old, and he lived alone in a house in Shaker Heights since my grandmother passed. He drove a 2009 Buick, and he watched Jeopardy every night, and he called me every Sunday at noon, without fail for the last 12 years. He had not been in the room today. I realized I had not seen him or heard from him, and I did not know if anyone had even called him. I asked the nurse if I could use the room phone. He picked up on the second ring, even though it was past 11. He said my name like a question, and then said it again like an answer. I told him where I was. I told him about the accident. I told him about the baby. He said, nobody called me. Your mother didn't call me. I said I know. He said I'm getting in the car. I told him it was 11 at night and he was 73. He said I'll stop in Akron if I get tired. I'll be there by morning. I didn't argue. There was no point in arguing with him about things he had already decided. He arrived at 7:45 in the morning, which meant he had not stopped in Akron. He walked into my room with his coat still on and his keys in his hand, and he hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then he pulled back and looked at my arm and my face and whatever else he was assessing, and he said, tell me everything. Don't leave anything out. So I did. I told him about the accident, and about my husband looking through the window, and about my parents suggesting a rental. I told him about the estate documents I had signed in March. I told him about the laptop and the phone calls and the business partner I had met twice. I told him about the feeling I'd had in the hospital room, that cold click of recognition, the joke I didn't know I was in. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which was very like him. When I finished, he sat back in the chair and looked at the window for a moment. Then he said, I want you to listen to me carefully. Do not sign anything else. Not one piece of paper, not a get well card. You tell me before you sign anything. I said okay. He said, I'm going to go downstairs and meet my great-granddaughter. He was down there for almost an hour. When he came back, his eyes were red but he was steady, the way he always was, like a very old tree in wind. He said she was beautiful. I started crying again and he just sat there and let me, which was also very like him. My husband came in around 9. He stopped when he saw my grandfather in the chair. There was a pause that lasted maybe 3 seconds and felt much longer. My grandfather stood up, slowly, because his knees were not good, and he shook my husband's hand and he said, good to see you, and his voice was perfectly pleasant and gave away absolutely nothing. He had a gift for that. My grandmother used to say that he had a face like a closed book, but you always had the feeling the story inside was not a nice one. My husband sat down. He seemed to be working to appear normal. He mentioned the traffic again. He asked about the baby's latest numbers. He said the doctors had told him 3 more weeks in the NICU, maybe less if she kept improving. My grandfather said, that's good news. Then he said, I understand you and your father-in-law have been talking quite a bit these last few days. My husband said, yeah, just coordinating. Figuring out next steps. My grandfather said, what kind of next steps? My husband said, just logistics. Recovery stuff. My grandfather said, I see. He said it in a way that communicated very clearly that he did not find this answer adequate but was choosing for the moment to let it go. After my husband left to get lunch, my grandfather made some calls. I don't know exactly who he called, but he had been a real estate attorney for 31 years before he retired, and he still knew people. He called from the hallway, not from my room, and when he came back, he sat down and folded his hands in his lap and said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer." He asked me about the documents I signed in March. I told him what I remembered. The attorney had explained that we were setting up a joint revocable living trust, which was fairly standard for couples with significant assets and a baby coming. The property from my grandmother's estate was going to be transferred into the trust. It would belong to both of us equally during our marriage. If something happened to me, it would pass to my husband and then to our children. My grandfather was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The attorney your husband sent you to. Do you remember his name?" I gave him the name. He wrote it down. He said, "I'll be making some more calls." Over the next 4 days, my grandfather essentially moved into that hospital. He brought a bag from a Walmart down the street. He slept in the chair in my room. He drove to Shaker Heights once to get his blood pressure medication and came back the same afternoon. The nurses adored him. He brought them coffee. He also, very quietly, was pulling a thread. My husband came in every morning and stayed for an hour or two and left. My parents came once more, on the third day, and my grandfather was present for that visit. The conversation was very polite and very careful, the way a conversation is when everyone in the room knows something is wrong, but nobody is willing to say it first. My mother talked about the baby's progress. My father asked about my physical therapy schedule. My grandfather smiled and answered questions and offered nothing. After they left, he told me what he had found. The attorney my husband had sent me to was someone who had done previous work for my husband's business partner. This was not a coincidence. The trust documents I had signed were legal, but they had been structured in a specific way, a way that, in the event of a divorce initiated by me, would make it significantly more difficult for me to extract my grandmother's property from the joint assets. It was not illegal. It was not even obviously wrong if you weren't looking for it, but someone had thought about it carefully. Someone had planned. My grandfather set a piece of paper on my tray table. He said, "I also had someone look at your car." I said, "The accident investigators already." He said, "I know. I had someone else look. Someone I trust." He said that the initial report had flagged a possible issue with my brake line, but had categorized it as consistent with normal wear. The person he had called, a mechanic he had used for decades, a careful man, had reviewed the same documentation and photographs and had a different read. The wear pattern was unusual. Not impossible, but unusual. The kind of unusual that you would want to look at more closely. I sat very still. He said, "I'm not telling you anything definitive. I'm telling you what questions are worth asking." I asked him who would have had access to my car. He said, "That's the right question." My husband and his business partner had met 3 times at our house in the 2 weeks before my accident. My car had been in the driveway each time. My husband had the spare key. I want to say that I didn't believe it at first. And that's true. In the way that things can be true and also incomplete. I didn't want to believe it. I went back and forth for most of that night, lying in the dark while my grandfather slept in the chair and the monitor beeped, and I thought about the man I had married 7 years ago, who had driven me to the airport at 4 in the morning without complaining, who had cried at our wedding in a way that surprised me, who had been someone I was sure of, and then I thought about the laptop, the phone calls, the attorney, the trust documents, the look on his face when he walked in that morning and found my grandfather sitting there. My daughter came to my grandfather's house, where we were staying, 22 days after she was born. She weighed 4 pounds and 9 ounces, and she made a sound like a small, indignant cat. My grandfather sat in the armchair in his living room and held her for a long time, and I watched him, and I thought about how my grandmother would have loved this, and I let myself cry about that in a quiet way that didn't upset the baby. 2 weeks later, I retained an attorney. My own attorney, a woman in Cleveland who had been recommended by a colleague of my grandfather's, and who had a reputation, as my grandfather put it, for being very thorough. I told her everything. She listened with the particular stillness of someone who has heard a lot of things and is not easily shocked. She said we had several issues to address simultaneously. The first was the trust documents. They were not unworkable, but they needed to be challenged on the grounds that I had not received independent legal counsel before signing. She believed we had a reasonable argument. The second was the accident. She said that the question of the brake line was something that needed to go to law enforcement, not just mechanics. She said she had contacts at the county level and would make some calls. She used the phrase, if there is something there, it needs to be found by the right people. The third was my husband's business finances, specifically the question of assets that might have been moved or obscured before a divorce proceeding. She said, "This is going to take time. It is not going to be comfortable. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at my grandfather, who was in the doorway of her office, because he had driven me there, and was waiting in the hall, and had then apparently drifted into the doorway. He gave me a small nod. I told her yes. My husband was served with divorce papers on a Tuesday morning in November. I know this because my grandfather drove me to a diner in Lyndhurst that morning, and bought me pancakes, and we sat there for 2 hours while he told me about my grandmother. Stories I had never heard. Small ones, the specific texture of a life together. And somewhere during that time, a process server was knocking on the door of our house, and I was eating pancakes with my grandfather and listening to him talk about my grandmother's laugh. It was one of the better mornings I had had in a very long time. The investigation into the brake line took 4 months. I will not pretend it was straightforward. The county did reopen the examination. There were depositions. There were weeks when my attorney called me every other day with updates that were progress, but didn't feel like it. Because progress in legal matters feels less like moving forward, and more like water finding a level, slow and unglamorous. My husband hired a very expensive attorney. His business partner hired a separate one. My parents, and this is the part I still find difficult to talk about. My parents hired one as well. Because it turned out that my parents had known about the trust documents. Not all of it, not the brake line. But they had known that my husband was concerned about the property from my grandmother's estate, and they had, I don't have a cleaner word for this, cooperated with the plan to structure those documents in a way that protected his interests at the expense of mine. My mother had called the attorney's office twice in the weeks before my appointment. The phone records were there. My grandfather did not say I told you so. He did not say anything much about it. He just sat with me at the kitchen table in his house in Shaker Heights, and let me work through it. And when I ran out of words he made tea. And when I ran out of tears he said, "Some people love money more than they love their children. And that is the saddest thing I know. But it does not mean there is anything wrong with you." He said, "You did not make them this way. You just found out what they were." My husband's business partner was eventually indicted. Not for the brake line. That case ultimately could not be proven beyond the standard required, which is a thing I have had to make a kind of peace with. But for financial crimes connected to the business, which my attorney's forensic accountant uncovered during the asset disclosure process. He had been running money through their company in a way that was very much not legal. My husband, it emerged, had known. He had participated. The business that I had watched consume our marriage from the inside had been built, at least in part, on something that would eventually cost him significantly more than he had ever hoped to gain. I got the house in Lakewood. The trust was successfully challenged. My grandmother's property came back to me fully, which felt, the day the paperwork was finalized, like receiving something I hadn't known had been taken until I had it back in my hands. My daughter is almost 2 now. She is loud and willful, and she has my grandmother's eyes, which is something my grandfather noticed before I did. She calls him by a nickname she invented herself, something that sounds like a cross between his actual name and a sound a pigeon makes, and he responds to it without any indication that he finds this undignified, which is the most love I have ever seen expressed by a person who does not use the word easily. We still live close to his house. Close enough that I can walk there on Sunday mornings, which I do most weeks, and he makes coffee and we sit on his porch if the weather allows, and sometimes we just don't talk about any of it. The accident, the hospital, the documents. My parents, who I have not seen since the depositions. Sometimes I think about that night in the hospital room, the ceiling tiles and the steady beeping down the hall, when I picked up the phone and called him, how close I came to saying no. Don't come, it's too late. How different everything might have looked if I had. But I called him and he got in the car, and he drove through the night without stopping in Akron. And when I look at my daughter now, the specific, complete realness of her, the way she fits in the world like she was always supposed to be there, I think about what it means that she is here, that we both are, that the people who wanted a different outcome for us did not get it. My grandfather says he's not done fighting yet. He says this while watching Jeopardy, mostly, or while losing at card games he pretends not to care about. He says it like it's nothing, like it's just the way things are, and every time he says it I believe him completely.